Greetings and welcome to LA Quill. Today we're diving into Chapter 2 of Arianna's tale. Two seabirds danced their mating dance above her, darting in and among the clouds. They seemed so happy, so content, so unaffected by what might be happening below. Feeling the soft sand beneath her bare feet, Arianna wished she could feel as free as they appeared to be. She took out the letter she had received only yesterday and read it again. Ari, the letter began. I know I promised to write, and I'm sorry it took me until now. I honestly didn't intend to wait so long. You're almost 17 now, I imagine. I know you're probably angry at me for not writing sooner, but it's been a hectic few years. Tarius and I have been everywhere, from one end of the Republic to the other. We've been visiting Sitha for almost a full year now. I hadn't been here since before you were born, before Mother and I went to Akana Valley. I met my father for the first time since I was 5 years old. While I was glad to see him, he was less than impressed with me. Our reunion was pretty much as I expected it to be. No worse, but certainly no better. How are things in Akana Valley? I expect you have become a proficient healer, more talented than our mother, even. The valley is probably grateful for your services, just as they were of hers. Contrary to what you probably believe, I do miss you, and I would love to hear from you. I would like to come back for a small visit in a month or so. If it doesn't bother you too much, please write back. The bird will wait until you place a letter in the message tube he wears, and then he will return to me. I finally found a use for my gift, meager though it is. It certainly is more efficient than a courier, and all the bird wants is food and shelter, so I don't have to part with any coin to send messages across the breadth of the Republic. Please write back. You might be angry with me, but don't deny me news of how you're doing. I worry about you. Your brother, Darian. She had immediately sent her response, indicating that she would indeed love for him to visit her, and that she was expecting him in exactly 1 month, earlier if possible. She had made it clear that she would tolerate no delays, a reasonable demand considering the fact that he'd abandoned her all those years ago. She had placed the note in the message tube as instructed, and the bird had left immediately, flying directly south. It had been almost 3 years since he had left her that day in the cottage. A long time to her way of thinking. Longer than she was comfortable with, really. And she hadn't heard anything from him, not once in all this time. Though she resented him for that, she wasn't angry enough to tell him to stay away. She'd never been good at holding grudges. She wanted her brother here. She wanted to see him again. She needed to know that he was doing as fine as his letter made it sound. She missed her brother. A lot. The village folk had been kind, had helped her in the days following Darian's departure, and continued to lend her assistance when asked. Their displeasure with Darian had been made very clear, both then and now. But they were always so nice to her, and were careful not to outright insult her brother while in her presence, though she was certain they did so behind her back. And she did try to be a healer to the village folk, though she wasn't very skilled, contrary to what Darian seemed to think. She had worked hard to make a life for herself, to find where she fit in the world. But she missed her brother. Sighing, Arianna focused her mind on her original reason for visiting the beach. Seaweed. She needed more seaweed for several of her herbal recipes, since it seemed every other remedy needed seaweed at some point in its preparation. And since it had to be dried for several days before it could be used, she had better gather at least some now. She had very little left in her stores. She figured she'd gather as much as she could find between the two rivers. She would not attempt to cross either river, not today. She probably wouldn't need that much seaweed anyway. Besides, the mayor, not wanting to lose the only healer the village had been very clear in his instructions. She was not to leave the valley without escort. If she did need to gather herbs from beyond the small inlet, she was to let him know, and he would arrange for a company of village men to go with her. He was her protector since she had no male family here, and as such, she had no choice but to obey him. She resented that a little, more than a little when she was honest with herself. Women had no rights, no freedom except that which was granted to them by the men in their lives. Father, brother, husband, sometimes a cousin. All women were expected to obey, immediately and without question. She didn't understand why, but it was the way of things. It made her uncomfortable to be viewed as inferior, especially when she didn't feel that way. Arianna refocused on the seaweed. It could take the better part of the day to accomplish her task, so she needed to hurry. She wanted to be home well before dark, or the mare might mount a search for her. Putting her errant older brother out of her mind and trying to ignore the irritation she felt about Darian and the mare, she began her trek along the beach, picking up any good piece of seaweed she found and adding it to her bag, a bag made of mesh so the seaweed could at least start to dry in the breeze. The bag also prevented mold from growing, so she would be sure to have usable seaweed when she returned home. A candle mark later, having gathered at least some seaweed, though not as much as she had hoped, she spotted something out to sea. It looked like driftwood, probably from a ship of some sort. Another shipwreck out on the rocks, she mused sadly, thinking about the last shipwreck she'd seen. In the past 10 years, the number of shipwrecks had increased dramatically. Instead of the usual 1 per year, they were averaging 6. There were 8 last year alone, and those were only the ones that had washed up on shore. Who knew how many more wrecks there had actually been out in the vast sea? The high number of shipwrecks indicated only one thing as far as the village folk were concerned. There would eventually be an invasion from the east. Every villager assumed that the ships came from the Abital Empire. Republican captains knew how to avoid the rocks that dotted the coastline, whereas the Imperial captains were almost certainly inexperienced, at least according to what the villagers said. And inexperience spelled disaster on the open sea, and utter devastation along the rocky coast. But that wasn't the only reason for their suspicions. The driftwood that washed up on shore wasn't the same as Republican ships used. It was redder and smoother than anything the Yarians had access to. West of the mountains of Mylara, most woods were a deep brown. The east was a desert, however, so the woods could be very different there. Combine those two factors, and it certainly spelled an invasion, at least as far as the mare was concerned. There had been war with the east for as long as anyone could remember. No one really knew why anymore, at least no one Arianna knew. The reasons behind the war had disappeared into history. Any overture of peace was rejected out of hand. They knew that much from the yearly dispatches from the capital. With the mountains of Mylara separating the two factions, however, there had been no real movement on either side for over 100 years. The mountains were just too difficult to cross for a large group, though small raiding parties crossed into the Republic once in a while. The Empire kept slaves, most of those stolen from the Yarian Republic. Since they stole the largest number of these from north of the Arden River, the king usually ignored these raids. Perhaps the Empire now thought that they could conquer by way of the sea. The Empire didn't have much ocean exposure, but the Republic did. They were mostly a coastal nation. It was theoretically possible to capture it with an attack from the sea, but only by experienced captains who could outsail their Republican counterparts. The Empire didn't have those captains, at least to her knowledge, so how they thought to conquer by sea was really beyond comprehension. It just didn't seem feasible to someone like Arianna. But then she wasn't a strategist. She was a simple peasant girl, and happy to be one. The village elders had contacted Sitha with their concerns, but had been ignored, as was usual in the Republic. No one from the capital really believed that the Empire would actually mount a sea assault, and even if the idea might have been believed, anyone from north of the Arden River was mostly ignored by the king anyway. It was just the way the Republic operated, and it had for many years now. Arianna's gaze returned to the piece of driftwood, which was slowly getting closer to the shore, bobbing in the waves. She'd be sure to report the shipwreck to the mayor. He would bring the men out to gather the wood for extra firewood once it reached the shore. The red wood burned very well and made the homes of the village smell sweet. It was much in demand, and the profit from it would allow the mayor to fund one of the programs he was so enthusiastic about. The clouds parted for a moment and the sun reflected off something that wasn't wood. She looked closer and could have sworn she saw movement, faint, but definitely there. That alone sent her running into the ocean, lifting her skirts above her knees. If someone was out there, it was her duty as a healer to help. She wasn't going to let a thing like the ocean stop her from doing her duty. She was up to her shoulders in water before she reached the man clinging to a small piece of wood as if his life depended on it. She supposed that it had. He had very dark hair, so black that in this light it looked almost blue. His skin was not fair like hers, but a deep bronze, as if it had been kissed by the sun for many years. He was strong and muscular, but far from ordinary. No ordinary man would have survived being trapped in the ocean for as long as he must have been there. He must have an extraordinary strength of will. That alone intrigued her. As she hauled him to shore, which was made easier by the buoyancy of the water, she decided that he probably wasn't a sailor. His hands, while calloused, were not nearly rough enough to indicate that he'd spent his whole life aboard ship. His clothes were too fine, and the sword he wore was of a higher quality than any sailor could afford, no matter how successful he might be. No, definitely not a sailor, of that she was certain. Who he might be, she really had no idea. But it didn't matter. He was hurt, and he needed her help. That was the only thing she needed to know about him, at least for the moment. Later, when he was safe and alive, she'd wonder who he was. Later, she would ask questions, begin to wonder at his identity and what had brought him here. Finally, on the sandy shore, she quickly looked him over. His breathing was shallow, but he was alive and even moving slightly. She needed to get him back to her cottage right now, where she could properly tend to his hurts. But she couldn't do that alone. He was just too heavy for a young woman to lift without any aid. It had been difficult enough to pull him onto shore. She'd never make it back to her cottage while trying to carry him. She was just too small for that. Making sure he wouldn't be swept back out into the sea while she was gone, she quickly went for help. She knew from the condition of the man that he wouldn't last long without her care. Arianna wasn't about to let him die because she was too slow in fetching help. Candle marks later, she finally sat down, purely exhausted. The strange man was resting in her brother's old bed. He was ill and cool to the touch, but alive. She had removed his wet clothing and started a fire. Though it wasn't yet cold, she knew the fire would help combat the natural cold his body would be feeling from his time in the ocean waters. He wasn't shivering, so she wasn't too worried about his body temperature. It was low, but not dangerously so. She was mostly concerned with his breathing. It was still shallow, but she'd forced several different potions down his throat and placed a warm pack with several herbs on his chest to aid his breathing. There was nothing more to be done. He'd live or die by his own willpower now. Judging from the little she knew of him, she thought his chances of survival were very good, better than most, in fact. It took an extraordinary will to survive what must have been candle marks in the frigid sea, perhaps even days. It was the first time anyone had washed up alive. There had been some bodies in the past decade. That was it. No survivors. No one who was even close to alive. The villagers were wildly curious about the man. He was tall and very dark, not like them at all. Everyone around here was small and blonde. It was common knowledge that anyone with dark hair was imperial, or so they claimed. Arianna wasn't sure of this, but since she had no other information at the moment, she decided to label him, in her mind, as a man from the east. Exhausted, Arianna decided to go to sleep. She wasn't sure she could keep her eyes open much longer. Tomorrow would be early enough to deal with the mysteries this stranger brought to her tiny valley. And that's our tale from L.A. Quill today. If you enjoyed this chapter, let me know your favorite moment in the comments. Until next time, may your stories always be magical.